Yo, what's going on, guys? I've been playing Black Myth Wukong non-stop like a lot of people out there, and I gotta say it's been a minute since I've had this much fun with the new IP, so I wanted to share my thoughts with you all. I had a very good first impression, but I wanted to wait until I had a better understanding of all the elements of the game so that I can better explain what I like and dislike and why. This was my first time hearing about Journey to the West, and I think that's going to be the case for a lot of people outside of China or Asia. To be honest, in my first playthrough, I didn't really absorb the story. I watched a lot of cutscenes and I especially liked the mini films at the end of each chapter. I think because they are all animated in different styles and you don't really have the itch to get to the next boss, but without context, I felt pretty lost. I ended up watching a series breaking down the 2,000-page book on YouTube, which I will link in the description because it was very concise and easy to follow, plus the format made it really fun to watch. The lore here is deep, guys. So deep. I will say, after watching that series and playing through the campaign a second time, I could appreciate how much respect and love there is here for the source material. Everything is handled and interpreted with tons of care and attention, making sure this 500-year-old text is not only linguistically translated, but also translated for current sensibilities, which isn't an easy task. It's really impressive to see how they've put together all these hues from a cultural palette as rich as China's. The storytelling, shapes, movement, sound, they painted a picture that feels both historical and modern. Every once in a while, a game comes out which is so inspired that it's contagious, and that's a special thing and worth noticing. Especially if we stop to think about all the games that are made with some specific business metric in mind, which ignores what makes gaming an experience that no other media can really match. To be fully immersed in a world that feels real to the mind isn't easy, at least not for me. There are all types of games, but personally I have to be able to connect some part of my personal experience to the world offered by the game I'm playing, and when that happens, it's just pure magic. It somehow recaptures that feeling of awe which new experiences can bring. When you connect with a game on a personal level, that's someone else's passion and emotion captured in a line of dialogue or a melody, or in the crafting of a combat system which, when properly executed, gives us a sense of our potential to overcome obstacles which often make us give up. We try and we fail, but if we try again, we learn, and we share what we've learned so that others can have an easier time of it, because through time and effort, we've put those obstacles behind us. To see and to be seen like that is probably at the heart of most, if not all, human endeavor. Black Myth Wukong is not a Souls game, but it is undoubtedly built on the foundation laid by those games. It fully embraces the ethos of a hostile, yet beautiful world, stacking unimaginable odds against the player from the beginning of their journey. Each new chapter bearing a lesson learned by accepting discomfort so that one can grow. But that's the main point of comparison, as Wukong feels and plays very differently otherwise, and that's precisely why I like this game so much, because it dares to stray from the formula, far enough that it finds its own character and identity, firmly planting both on a summit which towers alongside that of Souls. Now let's talk about the gameplay. If you haven't played it already and are watching this hoping to find out if this is a game for you, then let me first say that this game gets a full recommendation from me. Also, let this be your spoiler warning for gameplay, because I'll be showing footage from all the chapters, but I won't be spoiling the story, which is kinda hard to spoil since it's so complex, and this is not a lore video. Wukong is a semi-open world game. It's fairly linear as far as how the levels are laid out, with some room for free roaming and exploration, but I will say that they do have a lot of invisible walls, which somewhat ruins the immersion for me. I don't know that the alternative is better though. For example, God of War Ragnarok's level design felt to me like walking inside of a movie set, because the path was often blocked by geometry, and it made it feel very Wizard of Oz-y, if that makes sense. Especially parts in the jungle area in Vanaheim, but also many others. In comparison, Wukong offers some really cool vistas which open up the world, as they aren't blocked by geometry, but invisible walls instead. The effect is that it doesn't give one the same feeling of moving through a narrow path, as long as one doesn't try to break the illusion by trying to explore, as in an open world. The levels do get progressively bigger from chapters 1 through 5. Then the last chapter is an interesting mix of self-contained level design with incredibly open exploration within that containment, like a mini open world, which I actually enjoyed a lot. because of the item you get to traverse that area specifically. My only complaint, obviously, was that I wanted it to be bigger, but I think what they did was enough for me to enjoy the intention behind the design. Chapters 1 through 5 felt very intuitive to traverse for the most part, and although initially I felt that not having a map was the dumbest idea, I think that it actually benefits the semi-linear level design. I think they mean for us to get a little lost so that we can explore the levels more as they get bigger. Felt more immersive that way. What struck me the most was the level of detail within the design of shapes and textures in Wukong. The buildings, vegetation, weapons, armor, the way each NPC or enemy was conceptualized within a Chinese historical frame and yet adapted to modern sensibilities. You can see that in the differences when you look at each character design in your journal illustrations and compare them to their in-game counterparts. These differences make the world appealing, and that tells me that the game is aware of both its past and its present. In my opinion, they pulled it off brilliantly. Now let's move on to game mechanics. The game offers a Souls-like bonfire system. There's shrines where you can rest to replenish resources, which will make enemies respawn. There is no corpse running though, meaning that if you die, you won't drop your currency, so it's never at risk of being lost. You also have fast travel between shrines, and there's only a handful of specific quests that are missable from what I've seen. The game is very lenient that way, and it lets you progress to the next chapter without barring your return to finish up events like quest lines or boss fights later. Quality of life stuff that I really appreciate because it lets you do a blind playthrough without stressing about missing a bunch of stuff, which is always the case when I play Souls games, and that invariably ends up in me looking up guides for some convoluted questline that might require 2 more playthroughs. Now let's talk about the combat. I will tell you what my issues with it are before I give it the praise it deserves. The biggest offense is that I don't like how button mashy it is most of the time. Depending on your playstyle, you will spend 70 to 90% of the time mashing square because it is your light attack combo and how you start varied combos, which combine light and heavy attacks. That flaw becomes more obvious if we compare it to Stellar Blade, which did an amazing job creating combos that allow for way more player expression, or Sifu, which is another solid example. It makes the combat not only fun but engaging. You don't ever feel like you can get away with brainlessly mashing one button the whole time. It creates depth and allows for a more satisfying experience, which rewards precision and mastery of the combos and the combat system in general. Now that's not to say there's no depth at all. There's even some level of complexity which can be finessed. There are 3 stances which all have the same light attack combo and a unique heavy attack for each. There are also 2 types of weapons, staves and spears, which have movesets that offer some variety while not being completely unique. Smash and thrust stance both have counterattacks that have a parry-like mechanic in which, when timed right, an attack will avoid damage and punish the enemy. Pillar stance allows for a defensive move which perches up your character away from the ground before coming down with an overhead swing. Personally, I like smash and thrust better because of the counterattack, which rewards good timing. That and perfect dodging do enough to compensate for square mashing. That's it for the stances. You also have a number of spells and special abilities you can use to leverage the difficulty of some bosses, which can be quite high depending on skill and progression. One thing that I often see is that people would completely ignore consumables, which this game also offers in plenty, and are so strong that they can make the difference between winning or losing a fight, especially when you run into a difficulty spike. Often, you'll hear people complaining about difficulty when they don't take the time to look at all the tools available to them at any given point. As for difficulty and learning curve, I think some people will be inclined to think that's where Wukong feels like a Souls game, because some of those fights are very difficult and often unfair, but that's the point. First, you have to be patient. That's like rule number 1 in these games. Then, when you run into a wall, you really have to think about adapting to new challenges as they come, especially around the mid-game. There were 2 bosses in Chapter 4 where I was stuck for several hours, and some people might not enjoy that. Personally, it's one of those things where in that moment I can't say that I am enjoying it, but I also can't say that I'm hating it. You have to be able to tolerate discomfort. A lot of times it comes down to making a small adjustment in your build, a piece of gear that has been useful till now, and you might not realize there's something better you have access to. I think for me, finding a way to overcome the challenge of any fight is part of the enjoyment, as long as I think the fight is well crafted and it has a rhythm that I can learn. The bosses in Wukong are always interesting and engaging, which for how many there are is a very hard thing to accomplish. In the end, I see difficulty spikes as an opportunity to prepare for the endgame and to develop an intuition about how to tackle the next challenge. After Chapter 4, I didn't have as hard a time again with any of the bosses, including the last ones, which were more complex, but by then the combat's rhythm had clicked for me because of the time I spent stuck on certain bosses, and I really like that what you get is a direct result of what you put in. I really like the variety of spells and special abilities in the combat system. They compensate for the lack of variety in the stance combos. They're all flashy and make boss fights more dynamic. I'll say that if you're not getting that experience from the combat, definitely try to look up some builds online. It's possible that your build might not have much synergy going on. The weapons are interesting in that there's different slots for them. As you progress, you open up those slots, but within them, you have these progression trees. What's weird is that you can't upgrade weapons in the traditional sense, which is using materials to level up their stats. Instead, you use materials to craft new weapons and upgrade from one lower tier weapon to the next tier weapon. Even weirder is that once you use materials to craft a new weapon, you can't use the previous one unless you craft it again, which uses up materials. I guess the point is that you just forget about lower tier weapons and eventually just stick to the mythical ones at the end of the weapon tree. One thing that I was glad to see was that you can actually switch between weapons in different slots, which the game's logic made me assume I would have to recraft every time I wanted to switch to a different weapon. Armors can be upgraded traditionally though. I haven't tested all of them, but it seems that all can go from the lowest to the highest tier. Materials are scarce though, and during your first playthrough, you will only have enough to fully upgrade 2 armor sets. You get a lot more in New Game Plus though. Actually, you get a lot more of everything in New Game Plus. More will, more materials, more skill points, and the amounts you get are higher, which means you can craft and or upgrade more gear than you could in New Game. The perks for armor sets and weapons are fun and offer a good enough variety to keep you entertained for a while if you're into making builds. Nothing really out of the ordinary. Elemental stuff, crit stuff, etc. There's only one armor set which has a perk that can only be used in one boss fight, and you get the armor after said boss fight. It's like, what the hell? I feel like the devs were trolling us with that one. Your healing item is a gourd, and it also offers many options. There are several gourds, all of which have a unique perk. Then there's a drink you put in your gourd, which again has a unique perk. There's also many soaks, which grant boost to your drink, and the number of soaks can increase depending on your gourd/drink. This system was different and new to me, and I really like the effect that it had on build crafting. One other thing that Wukong does differently is the skill tree. Normally, skill trees unlock combos or special abilities, but in this game, skill points are also used to level up base stats like defense, stamina, and attack power, as opposed to using the game's currency to level up your stats. You use skill points for everything related to the combat system actually. All your spells, stances, and special abilities are unlocked using them. Except for relics, which are bonuses for all the different elements in the combat system. You unlock a new relic perk at the end of each chapter. There's 3 perks per relic, and they stack with each New Game cycle, so at the end of New Game Plus, you will have all 3 perks unlocked for all 6 relics, giving you a total of 18 different bonuses. The full gear system comprises these elements: main weapon, vessel, spirit, armor, curios, and gourd. Your vessel and spirit work on something called might, which regenerates as you do damage. Vessels are special gear found in 4 out of the 6 chapters, and they are meant to nullify specific boss mechanics, usually for the last boss of the chapter where you found them, but also useful for others. Spirits usually pop in and out to do a quick damage burst and offer different passive bonuses like defense or crit chance. Weapons and armor have stats and perks like in most games. Curios are this game's version of talismans. You start with 2 slots and then you can unlock 3 in New Game and 4 in New Game Plus. Below your health bar, you have a mana bar and a stamina bar, all of which work as you would expect. Mana is used for your spells and you need gear items to help you regenerate it. Mana affects 3 out of the 4 spell slots available to you. The 4th one is your transformation, which allows you to turn into one of 10 characters with its own health bar and abilities. Transformations are instead connected to might, and once their health bar or might bar is consumed, you transform back into your character. One thing that I personally place a lot of importance in is how fluid character animations are, not just when in combat, but also transitioning from slower to faster movement, directional transitions, jumping animations, knockdown animations, etc. It's honestly one of the reasons that I can't get into Team Ninja games because their animations are so stiff and dated looking that I just can't enjoy controlling my character, which is what you do most of the time you're playing. Wukong has some of the smoothest, most realistic animations I've seen, and I couldn't be happier with that aspect of the game. The soundtrack is solid. While not reaching From Software levels of epic majesty, it does a great job at providing a counterpoint to a wide variety of moments. I pay a lot of attention to video game soundtracks, and when they do their job, it's like they're a character in the background whose role is central to the story. I found myself randomly humming some songs from it, which is always a good sign. Lastly, there's performance. The game works great on performance mode for me at 60 FPS. I only had a brief moment of frame drops once while I was streaming, and 2 crashes so far. Now, there is some heavy sharpening on performance mode, which I'm not a fan of, but it doesn't ruin the experience for me. I did notice that faster movement distorts images significantly, which you can notice if you spin the camera around your character. You'll notice pixelation around the outline of your character, and these vertical lines on either side of the screen. I do hope that the image quality will improve though. Lords of the Fallen, for example, looked much rougher when it first released, and now after several patches, it looks pristine. Neat and crisp image quality and rock solid 60 FPS. Before I go, I should talk about the Platinum Trophy, which I just got. Definitely on the easier side, as I was able to get 2/3 of the trophies just playing the game organically, with only a few trophies that required either New Game Plus items or a missed quest. The worst part for me was the trophy related to seeds that are RNG drops from plants, as you can't farm them by just resting at a shrine and instead have to wait 30 minutes before they respawn. Some of the seeds took hours and that just wasn't fun. I think that's the worst sin I can accuse Wukong of, which is the sin games commit of adding artificial playtime by tying trophies to RNG. I had a lot of fun in New Game Plus because enemies aren't well balanced to your level, and with all the stuff you unlock by then, it's a very fun power trip, which some of us enjoy from time to time. I enjoy both actually, power trip or skill check types of New Game Plus. It's similar to Stellar Blade in that it's a game that I'll play through a couple of times on release and have a blast. Then again sometime after a year or two. Definitely not like Ghost of Tsushima Legends because no multiplayer, but it is comparable to Ghost Campaign, which I've only played maybe 3 times since release. Most of the games I end up playing longer after release have a multiplayer or co-op option. Honestly, I think if devs want their games to have a longer shelf life, they should look into making games with multiplayer the norm, instead of creating trophies that take way too long to grind for. If you have a fun game with good combat, you have like 80% of the assets you need for a fun multiplayer loop. You don't even need to support it that much, or at all. Just look at Ghost. Legends hasn't had an update in about 2.5 years and it still has a really healthy player base. So, to recap, I give story a 9, combat an 8, soundtrack a 7, level design a 7.5, aesthetics 9, animation/movement 9.5, and performance a 7. All in all, I give Black Myth Wukong an extremely solid 8 out of 10. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one. Goodbye.
Yeah.